left Egypt, and now we are just outside of Amman, Jordan. It took us a day to get here, a long drive up from Sinai to Cairo, an hour flight from Cairo to Amman, a little drive here to our next spot. You know, what took us a day should have taken the Israelites about 2 weeks, but instead of taking 2 weeks, it took them 40 years. And understanding why that journey was not a 2-week journey, but a 40-year journey is the next snapshot that we need to put into our OT panoramic. I'll see you on top of the mountain in just a minute.
The Hebrew people had been miraculously delivered from slavery in Egypt, and now they were free. But they also felt like they were in the middle of nowhere. Their journey through the wilderness should have taken only a few weeks. According to the book of Numbers, it began with a census of the men in each of Israel's tribes who were able to go to war. That in itself signaled adversity, though at the beginning, the hearts of God's people seemed prepared for that. But the hardships of life in the wilderness disillusioned many, and some complained and even rebelled against Moses' leadership. God graciously gave his people manna from heaven for food and water from a rock to keep them going. But wilderness life was still difficult. In the midst of that hardship, many people remained focused on life back in Egypt, where at least things were predictable, instead of keeping their eyes on the abundance of the promised land. And when Moses sent 12 spies into the land to scout it out, 10 were filled with fear and came back with a negative report. Because the inhabitants in the land were big and strong, the promise seemed impossible. 2 of the scouts, Joshua and Caleb, never lost sight of the fact that the promised land was actually promised, that God would fulfill what he had said. They alone would outlive their own generation. The journey that should have taken weeks would now take 40 years. Not because of the difficult terrain or enemy opposition, but because God stood in the way between a generation that refused to walk in faith and a land that required faith to enter it. Only the children of those freed from Egypt, plus Joshua and Caleb, would arrive in the land of Canaan one day. The current generation had proven itself short on faith and patience. Only those trained by the journey would receive what had been promised. Still, even in those 40 years of wandering, God was gracious. In addition to providing manna and water, he continued to lead by a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. He defended and vindicated Moses in the presence of his opponents. He gave Moses new strategies for leading so many people. He protected his people against their adversaries, including one king who hired a mercenary prophet named Balaam to curse Israel. He gave Israel's priests a blessing to continually speak over the people, and he prepared the next generation to walk in faith and receive his promises. At the end of the 40 years, Moses delivered several sermons or speeches to this next generation. These are recorded in Deuteronomy, literally a second law, and they emphasize the most essential commands, especially the command to love God with all their heart, soul, and strength, and to teach the whole law to their children. This covenant came with numerous promises, blessings for those who followed God and his word with a whole heart, but catastrophic consequences for those who were not attentive to his ways. If they continued to love him well, they and the land would thrive. If they did not, they would be scattered among the nations and suffer hardship. The people of Israel would need to be very careful to remember these things in the days, years, and centuries to come. This second proclamation of the law, with charges and challenges to keep it diligently, amounted to Moses' parting words to the people. He had led them to the edge of the land of promise. And now it would be upon them and a new leader to take them in.
Sometimes my wife, rightfully so, accuses me of starting a project around the house and then not quite getting it done, just leaving a little bit unfinished. Any other spouses that can relate to that? I get distracted, I move on to the next project. So sometimes life just, kind of gets in the way. Sometimes it's my own mistakes. There's always something, though, that just is nagging you in the back of your mind when you leave a project unfinished. I wonder sometimes what Moses felt when he was standing where I'm standing today at the top of Mount Nebo. Moses was leading the people of God. They were at Sinai. He had received the law. They camped at the base of Sinai for a full year as they put into place a full cycle of the festivals and the feasts. They left Sinai on the way to the promised land, but because of the rebellion and the disobedience of the people, they were disciplined, and a whole generation of the Israelites would die out before they were allowed to enter the promised land. And so they wandered for 40 years before coming to this region. But something happened in Moses' life. And Moses, though he led the people here to the edge of the promised land, would not be allowed to lead the people in. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 1, God tells Moses to climb up here to the top of Mount Nebo. Then Moses climbed to Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah across from the Jericho. And then down at verse 4, the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. Moses comes here to Mount Nebo, and he looks, if you look behind me, the promised land is there across the Jordan. And God lets Moses see it with his eyes, but he doesn't let him lead the people there. He dies in this region. And to understand why Moses was not allowed to lead the people into the promised land, we have to flip back in our Bibles to the book of Numbers, chapter 20, verse 2. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." You can almost understand the people's frustration at this point. They've been wandering in this desert, barren wilderness, and they're saying there's no food, there's no water to drink. And they begin to grumble and complain against Moses for the situation they find themselves. And they even say, and this is pretty remarkable, we were enslaved in Egypt, and we were kind of better there with food and water to drink. Why did you bring us into this barren land? I know as our team is driven through this region, it is dry, and there is not much water, and I haven't seen a lot of pomegranates, and you can almost be understanding of why the people are concerned. And so verse 6, Moses appears to handle this very well. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink." Moses, you have to appreciate what he does. It seems like really, really good leadership here, doesn't it? He doesn't speak harshly to the people. He and Aaron, they go to the tent of meeting, the place of worship, and they fall face down before God, and they cry out to God, and God responds in this this compassionate way. He says, get the rod and go to the rock and speak to it, and he would provide the water for the people and for their livestock. It seems as if everything is going well here. But at verse 9, Moses begins to divert away from God's instructions. Listen to see if you notice the difference of what Moses does from what God instructed. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Did you catch where he diverted from God's instructions? 3 real specific changes to what God had said. First, Moses calls them rebels. Listen, you rebels. That word rebels is used to describe those who have rejected God. He offers judgment to them. And then he says, must we bring water out of this rock? It's interesting, isn't it, that Moses sort of inserts himself in the miracle that's about to be performed here. And then he strikes the rock twice. God didn't give instruction about striking the rock. He had earlier, but here he says, speak to the rock, verse 8. Moses grabs the staff and twice he strikes it. God does provide the miracle. God does provide the water. It gushes out of the rock, and all of the people and all of their livestock are cared for and provided for with the water. But Moses' diversions from God's instruction was significant in the eyes of God. And it's verse 12 that helps us understand why. Numbers chapter 20, verse 12. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. Did you hear what God says to Moses? You failed to trust in me enough to honor me as holy. God is holy. God is separate. God alone is to be worshiped. But Moses failed to trust in God. In fact, it seems as if Moses was beginning to trust in his own power, in his own provision, and in doing so, he put himself in the position of God rather than honoring God. And in fact, those 3 ways in which Moses' actions diverted from God's instructions are all ways in which he was just putting himself in the place of God. He offered judgment. Remember, he called them rebels. You rebels. God didn't say, go judge the people. God said, go take care and show compassion to the people through what God was going to do. And yet he offered judgment on them. And I just wonder how often we do the same, rather than being the hands and feet of Jesus, offering care and compassion to others, we lead with judgment and condemnation. He relied on his own power. He used must we bring water out of this rock? And I wonder how often we put ourselves in that place too. Our strength, our skills, our gifts that are going to make a difference in the world. Moses struck the rock, not to speak to the rock like he was instructed, but struck the rock. And maybe out of frustration, maybe he was just trying to speed along the miracle, do things in his way rather than in God's way. And I wonder how often we do that. God's plan, God's purpose seems to be moving a little too slow for us, and we try to speed it along into what we want and what we see. Moses was putting himself in the place of God rather than drawing attention and worship to God as holy. And I think that's the message for us on Mount Nebo. We can't serve God and be God. We can't serve God the way that God wants us to serve Him and think that we are putting ourselves in the place of God. We can't serve God and trust in our own strengths and in our own abilities. We can't serve God and want to see God work through our lives and yet think that it's our skills and our gifts that make a difference in the world. We can't try to serve God with our life and think that we're going to get the glory for it. We can't serve God and think God's going to fit into our perfect little plans. If we rely on our power, our strength, our gifts, looking for our glory, we are an impediment to God's power at work in our lives. You know, all of us want to be used by God to make a difference in the world. I'm sure all of us do. But we can't serve God and be God. This is always an emotional spot. This is the third time I've been to Mount Nebo, and it's just a weighty spot for me. Because I begin to think about, you know, what have I missed out on because I got in the way of what God was trying to do? Where did I try to get the glory for myself? Where was I trying to fit God's plan into my ways or my ideas? Where instead of trying to be compassionate and caring to others, did I offer judgment instead? I don't want what I feel at this spot for you. I don't want you to ever feel that you experience less than all God has for us because we don't trust in Him to honor Him as holy. Where are we tempted to offer judgment instead of care and compassion for others? Where are we tempted to be self-reliant on our abilities, our gifts, our skills, our talents? Where do we try to get the glory and the recognition and the honor for ourselves rather than to honor God as holy? Here's the lesson of Mount Nebo. We can't both serve God and be God. And because Moses missed that, Moses missed the privilege of leading the people through the valley, right over there, across the Jordan, and into the promised land. I'll see you in just a minute.
Moses was gone, and Israel needed a leader. God chose Joshua. He challenged Joshua repeatedly to be strong and courageous as he led the people across the Jordan River and into the land, and he assured Joshua of his constant presence. In fulfilling that promise, God provided help in many ways. He inspired a harlot named Rahab to aid Israel's scouts as they planned their invasion of Jericho. He required this next generation to be the people they were called to be, to consecrate or rededicate themselves before they entered the land. And in a divine appearance, as the commander of the Lord's armies, he challenged and encouraged Joshua before the battle at Jericho. Whatever it took, God demonstrated that He would make a way. And if Israel was faithful, they would overcome every obstacle. God led them across the Jordan at flood stage. From a human perspective, a very dangerous time to cross a river. He brought down the walls of Jericho after His people marched around it for days, according to His command. He purged the nation of sin when one family violated His instructions not to gather the spoils after battle. And even when His people made unwise agreements or compromises, God continued to lead them into their promise. He always has a knack for showing up in the most impossible situations and revealing His nature in the midst of them, just as He is willing to do in our lives today. Throughout the conquest, Israel divided the land and conquered it piece by piece. It was a process designed by God, who taught them how to battle and remained faithful throughout, even letting their failures become lasting object lessons for later generations. Joshua's leadership, honed for years by observing Moses and spending time in God's presence at the tabernacle, demonstrated the ways of God. And in keeping with his call to be strong and courageous, He boldly declared a heartfelt commitment that Israel would have done well to follow in the coming centuries. For me and my house, we will serve the Lord.
Moses' disobedience prevented him from getting to enter the promised land. But it's important to remember that he still got the people to the edge of the promised land. He still led the people all the way up until his death here at Mount Nebo. You know, I think it's a healthy reminder that just because we have failure in our lives, it doesn't mean that God can't use us any longer. And just because we might have failed, God is still going to be faithful to His plan and still work through our lives. And I find that to be very encouraging. Well, after 4 decades of wandering in the wilderness, the people are ready to enter the promised land. And that's where we will pick up our story next time.